The gecko index remained at 0, but I'd seen dolphins swimming and blowing near the boat. I'd seen prickly pear cacti laden with fruit I would not have the confidence to attempt to eat. Such viciously defended fare. I'd seen a large grasshopper which flew rather than leapt, turquoise wings. A satisfying day's observations, even if no geckos. I was now ready to leave again with a fair breeze to p37. I always liked that name. It was the port of call for some friends I met while on my previous boat in Falmouth. And I associate the word p37 with those two friends who sailed off to the Caribbean aboard a 24-foot sailing boat on their way to New Zealand. I relaxed deeper into the Spanish experience. Rowing ashore, always a more satisfying way to get along than using the outboard motor. I landed on a beach of white sand. I pulled the dinghy up above the high tide mark and walked into the outskirts of p37. I found a steep road towards some woods. The woods were eucalyptus, very tall, thin trunks with high leaf canopy, thin pointed leaves, the size and shape of a banana. I walked into an unfenced area on the edge of the eucalyptus wood. Rocky outcrops and ferns interspersed with patches of gorse. The ground was a mixture of black peaty, wet soil and drier parts covered in viney sticks. I sat on a hunk of granite watching a pair of crows and letting the place settle down around me and me relax into it. The crows were displaced by a cackling magpie. The sun disappeared and reappeared as large cumulus continued out of the west. The Ria and distant Muros glittered, and the further mountains were bright with sunny patches on rock peaks. It was a point of arrival for me. I looked at Spain and thought, I'm here. I did it. Soon the Rias Baixos would be a rich source of memories, and I would be negotiating with the slightly worrying coast of Portugal. Sailing along endless sandy beaches is not as simple as it sounds. The problem can be actually seeing the shore and knowing when one is too close. With large Atlantic swells, most of the Portuguese coast must be given a good offing. Sailing 3 to 4 miles offshore solves most of the problem until a port is approached. Most Portuguese ports are artificially built out the beach with a couple of enfolding harbour walls. As I sat watching the Ria de Muros in its splendour, I was a mixture of calm satisfaction at making it this far, but also the desire to go further was working strongly inside. The cruising life sounds idyllic, and it sometimes was, but there were many concerns and sources of anxiety for the sailor. I wondered sometimes about how much I really enjoyed sailing, with its harshness on body and mind. Sitting grounded on that rock, the scent of eucalyptus flowing past on warm breezes, and crows just being crows nearby. I asked myself whether it was going sailing I liked, or arriving in new places and regaining land. If a sailing boat was merely a way to move one's stuff around and a place to sleep, it would seem a very inconvenient and uncomfortable way to travel. Again, I headed to the Onoso bar to write and enjoy the peace of my solitude. The picture windows held views as good as the Café Caldi in Tenby. I noticed a sheet of stratocumulus cloud moving in from the west and thought it time to get back to the dinghy and row out to Storm Petrel. Changes in the weather were critical when at anchor. I moved without haste or worry, but I moved back to the boat. Page 40. Groupthink in low pressure. The Isla de Sées were 3 islands stretching 5 miles along the Spanish coast. The Spanish tourist board had provided my pilot book with an aerial photograph showing Bayona with the Isla de Sées in the background. Beaches of white sand and high cliffs with a narrow isthmus between 2 of the 3 islands. A very attractive anchorage promised white sand, and I had planned a route which would take me past the beaches on Isla de Sées. So if the weather was stable, I could spend a while in some of the most exotic scenery, as cruising folks say, this side of the Caribbean. But a low-pressure weather system had been situated west of Spain, out in the Atlantic, for several days, and so I felt an urge to make best speed to a more sheltered anchorage. The weather was not settled. I left Port-au-Cygnes with a bank of foggy cloud flowing down the valleys and over the mountain tops around the Ria. Thick cloudy mist flowed in from the north and followed me for 10 miles as I made out to sea and turned southward in the direction of Bayona. I managed to stay ahead, although it was gaining, and now there were rolls of thunder in it. The diesel engine popped its way through the hours, and I bit my lip as ragged fragments of low cloud began overtaking me. The weather forecast had told of a low pressure system, but assured me it was losing its identity. I reasoned it would do all the worrying things which low pressure systems do, but with a declining energy pattern, and therefore nothing seriously concerning for me in Storm Petrel. The sky went uniform grey, and the coast disappeared in murk. But I sensed the thunder was the dying groans of a disturbance, rather than a building storm. Sailing wing on wing, with the sails on opposite sides of the boat, and let out as far as they would go, felt like a bird gliding downwind, with wings held out to catch the breeze. White foam spread out in front and to the side as each wave accelerated us forward. The hiss of aerated water seethed momentarily and then passed astern as the next acceleration came with the next wave. I left the Isla de Sées well inshore because the mist and murk persisted throughout the day. As I headed offshore, I was a bit concerned about the low visibility and scooting ragged black clouds. The decision to miss out the splendour of Isla de Sées was well founded because the visibility was worse inshore and around the islands and rocks. Offshore, I sailed along and was joined by dolphins. They dived under the boat and played in the bow wave. I laughed and whistled at them. They seemed to hear my excited yelps and whoops. My mood was lifted by the wonderful company they gave, and I felt safer in my decision to take the offshore exposed route to Bayona. The summer wind along the West Iberian coast blows mainly from the north. Northerly winds of summer had largely deteriorated by September, and the conversation amongst all cruising boats concerned the wind direction. Everyone was waiting for it to become northerly. The day I arrived in Bayona, 20 cruising boats had left to head further south. The same weather situation, which had encouraged me to leave Port-au-Cygnes, gave them the opportunity to sail. They had apparently been waiting up to a month in Bayona for fair winds. I did not like to be involved in groupthink, where the tendency of individuals is to modulate their opinions so they are more alike when they are gathered together. It is a theory in social psychology and has been used to explain why, for instance, Nazi concentration camp workers carried out inhumane duties without question. I preferred to make my own decisions about the weather and whether to sail or not. From my perspective, arriving in Bayona seemed a real achievement in my push towards the warm south. The very word Bayona sounded much warmer than grey-sounding Muros, and I could certainly imagine winter snows cloaking the mountains around Camarinas. Bayona was the southernmost of the Ria Baixos and the last significant port in Spain before Portugal. One depression does not make a winter, and I knew there would be hot, sunny days in Bayona before I too felt the urge to flee south again. The day after arriving saw me taking a siesta with all the hatches open, sweating in the heat of mid-afternoon with my clothes discarded on the bunk opposite. A single-handed sailor must make her own decisions, and this gives the satisfaction of an intense and personal form of experience. Most single-handers are very open to communication with other sailors because there is always something to learn, such as there's a deepening low just off the west coast of Portugal, or there are free showers in the yacht club. The single-hander prefers individual communication rather than the mass movements of cruisers under the shadow of groupthink. Santa, whoever, was being celebrated by various noises erupting in the sky above Bayona. They were not fireworks, rather they were maroons, similar to those used in ports in the UK to summon the lifeboat. Rising above the Spanish maroons was out of the question. They were not calls to lifeboatmen, just big bangs. Some were so heavy they made my head ring. There were either groups of 8 moderately ear-splitting cracks, or there was 1, 2, 3 or 4 mega bangs. This went on for over an hour, leaving everyone with ears so numbed we all just grinned at each other wordlessly when it was over. Conversation had been cancelled out in a ring of newly generated tinnitus. During the bangs, Annie on piece 4 lost patience and began reacting to every crack with a "No!" which itself became doubly intolerable. I sparked ashore to see some of the goings on, wandering up into the older streets where plenty of people were coming and going. A line of market stalls led up to a church, offerings of local foods, cheeses and preserved meats with flies liberally crawling on it all. The other goods on sale were things to wear which all had either a cannabis leaf or an alien head motif. The sellers on the food stalls appeared to be locals. The sellers on the cannabis leaf or alien head items all appeared Peruvian. A little figure with shiny, long black hair in a ponytail begged at each stall. She looked Peruvian too, half my height and quite old. I don't think she even saw my face, only my long-fingered, big-palmed, bronzed, hard-worked hands hanging at the hips of my jeans. I suppose I was just another tall Nordic type on holiday from the rich northern lands. These well-off tourists were pleasant and polite to local working people, but despite their sensitivity to rural and poor people, they clearly came from a world where north is up, above, and higher in economic status than the south. Simplistic, I admit, but I, in my threadbare jeans and shoes rusting at the eyelets, could return to my sailing boat in the harbour, and I had several months' food supply, as well as fuel and oil, to last me several hundred miles, so I was rich in a sense. I ignored the blue alien heads and the cannabis leaf motives, and the old lady begging was similarly disinterested in my face. I might as well have been an airbrushed alien hovering over her, as she passed my hands remained impassively limp at my sides, and this was enough to turn her towards the next stall to ask there instead. Other sellers in the street market were African. They offered a range of leather wristbands, handbags, Iron Maiden bum bags. Aha, just what I wanted. Not Iron Maiden, but a place to carry my passport and debit card away from my shoulder bag. So I searched the fly-speckled aisles for a bum bag to suit my need. Very nice, stallholders suggested solicitously. Others simply clicked their tongues, which meant, look at my goods, buy something, you bastard. I found a bum bag small enough to fit inside tight jeans. I was pleased with this because it would be a much safer way to carry a money card on my lizard walks. For €6 I had a well-made double-zipped pouch with a quality webbing belt and a strong plastic click fastener, thanks to the sainted one whom the day was devoted to and who blessed me with a bum bag. Donut-shaped bready things were on many stalls. They were called cristaleros, and I bought some at the last opportunity after being undecided as to how pleasant they would taste. I got entangled in the purchase by my confusion, cleverly managed by the chatty sellers over the price. I made the mistake of asking the difference between one brand of cristalero and another. The one was more flavoured, more tasty than the other, the woman sellers assured me. They took my money and I was sure they would retain the change, despite a lowering of the agreed price from €2.50. They took my money and I was sure they would retain the change, despite a lowering of the agreed price from €2.50 to €2.25. I disengaged from the chatting stallholders, a bit unhappy about the cost of cristaleros, but the bright-eyed, rounded seller with her black hair back in a long ponytail gestured strongly with her fruit picker arms and handed me the change with a smile. I was pleased they had taken my money by agreement rather than by fudging it. All seemed good until I tasted the cristaleros. There were about 8 in a pack. They looked like ring donuts. The wording on the packet stated these were the best Asturian cristaleros locally made by skilled craftsmen who have been making them all their lives. Asturias is the region east of Galicia famous for food. But they were like rings of bread which had been left to go stale in the hot fly-ridden sun and then had been dribbled with a paste of white sugar, maggoty flour and water. Not at all pleasant. A packet of saintly sweetbreads cost as much as a third of the bum bag. I'd been pleased with the bag and wanted to appease the saints after the luck of getting what I'd wanted. Occasionally one makes a real discovery by trying new things, not with cristaleros though. Hungry still, I chose a small stall with a large apple picker sort of woman who was offering pastry savouries. There was meat or tuna. I chose tuna and batted away a few flies as I paid around €1 for it. Not expensive for a large golden coloured fried savoury, just what I fancied. It was delicious as I stood in the shade of a eucalyptus tree watching the festival market being gradually depleted by Spaniards, Peruvians, tourists, sailors and flies. Later, out at the anchorage, a collection of sailors drank, played music and chatted on P4's large expanse of deck space. Warren catamarans are sold with the promise of becoming sea people, and the brochures show attractive naked sailors populating wide deckings. We all enjoyed the gathering of international sailors and musicians like true sea people, but we kept our clothes on. We played music ranging from Eric Clapton's Layla to Swedish folk songs. The latter were done by a single-hander with a large white accordion. The former was sung and played on a nice steel-strung guitar by a Swedish sailor whose partner looked like Billie Holiday. I closed my eyes and sent swirling phrases in amongst the anchored boats and catabatic plunges of notes down through the slats. Later we ended up on a large red Swedish ketch drinking coffee and Danish bitters, a bit like an evil version of schnapps. The bitters were so strong as to sober one up, suddenly followed by an unstoppable drunkenness. "It is good for your body," claimed the Billie Holiday-like singer, rubbing her belly and torso sensually. We all tipped Danish bitter down our throats, and the cabin briefly glowed like a bar scene in a Fassbinder film. The accordionist apologised for his serious expression, saying it was because he had been a judge. He added he had also been a go-kart driver. Now he was a single-handed sailor. He chatted in Swedish to the host as she mobilised another round of bitters. Another Swedish single-hander picked up a comment I made about geckos. "I had one on the boat once," he said. I was suddenly sober again, marvelling at the thought of a liveaboard gecko. "It came aboard when I was alongside a quay. He stayed for several weeks, but when I sailed back to Europe, I did not see him anymore." My sad eyes reflected the thought of a gecko lost at sea. When I cleared out the boat the following winter, I found the gecko dead in a locker. He had all dried up. We drank rich Swedish coffee and more schnapps, which was a heady mixture after wine and song. "Drink up, is good for you," she said again. A German sailor did the torso rubbing this time. "It's good for you," he said, parodying the host. We were getting drunk, and so several people made their way up on deck into the cool, starry air. Cruising sailors think little of descending from a boat 5 feet down into a wobbling dinghy in the dark when they are drunk and the water is around 10 meters deep. Somehow we all found our boats and boarded them with little more than a wet bum or shoe. Bayona was a very pleasant anchorage. It was the beginning of a community of cruisers, all with similar ideas about sailing, life and boats. Piece 4 had their sea people hats on, The marina, where we all left our dinghies while ashore, was most pleasantly and politely managed. There was an old reputation of Bayona being a snobby, unhelpful marina. However, this was not true any longer. The other cruising folk, many whom had been there before, agreed it was impeccably run. Bayona provided a usefully stocked chandler's, and I walked several times along the long street which looked out on the anchorage to the Autoheart for engine oil, outboard motor oil, and a Portuguese courtesy flag. I even bought a Spanish courtesy flag because I had not flown one yet. I bought tubing for a refueling system suggested by Annie. I got some pads which I meant to soak up oil but not water from the bilge. I bought 2 spark plugs for the dinghy engine. It was good to have spent so long without access to my bank account, for now I could afford to buy spares and maintenance items. The impression I had of Portugal was of a place where spares would be hard to find. It would be like going into the Congo or up the Orinoco. It turned out that advice was more out of date than the country. When I arrived in Portugal, my first impressions were of a more subtle character than Spain. Somehow both cooler and warmer, metaphorically and literally. The scenery had more detail and more colour. Portugal smelt of new shoes, non-leather ones. I was using an old sailing pilot book. Well, I assumed nothing much would have changed as I entered Viana de Castelo harbour. I made my way through various inner entrances towards the yacht marina, indicated on the harbour plan. A policeman was suddenly gesturing from the quay wall at me. He was telling me yachts were not permitted in this bit to go elsewhere. He indicated with a curving sweep of his hand. As I did a handbrake turn in an old lock, I thanked the official for his help. "Gracias," I called, and then remembered to try not to speak Spanish to the Portuguese. A universal trait of English tourists was to speak Spanish phrases at Portuguese people, and then embarrassedly correct them, as if they had insulted them. The trouble is, English people speak awful Spanish, and their Portuguese is non-existent. Portugal changed the second language from French to English several years ago. Films were subtitled in Portuguese, and so the English, read American, was heard. I found most Portuguese knew a lot more English language than I knew Portuguese language.